Ask anyone what gun won the Wild West and you will get the same answer. The Colt single-action Army revolver, the Peacemaker. The gun that Wyatt Earp carried, that Doc Holliday holstered, that Buffalo Bill twirled for crowds across 2 continents. The gun that Hollywood put in the hands of every cowboy, sheriff, and outlaw for 100 years of cinema. 6 shots, single action, 45 caliber, blued steel, and walnut grip. The icon, the legend, the answer. Except that answer is incomplete in ways that fundamentally change how you understand the frontier, the violence that defined it, and the people who actually shaped the outcomes of its most famous confrontations. The Colt Peacemaker was real, it was important, and it killed its share of men. But the gun that actually determined the outcome of more fights, more range wars, more stagecoach robberies, more ambushes, and more battles between the United States Army and the indigenous nations that refused to disappear was not a handgun at all. It was a rifle. And not the one you have probably heard of either. Before we get there, we have to understand what the mythology of the single-action revolver actually was versus what it actually did. And to do that, we have to start not in a gunfight, but in a courtroom. Specifically, in the aftermath of one of the most analyzed gunfights in American history. The gunfight at the OK Corral on October 26, 1881, in Tombstone, Arizona Territory, lasted approximately 30 seconds. When it was over, 3 men were dead, 2 more were wounded, and Wyatt Earp had entered the American mythology. The fight involved Colt revolvers on both sides. The Earp faction carried them. The McClory brothers and Billy Clanton carried them. The distances involved were somewhere between 6 and 15 feet. At those distances, with those weapons in 30 seconds, 3 men died, and 2 were seriously wounded out of a group of 8 participants total. That is a hit rate, if you want to be clinical about it, of roughly 60%. And it happened at nearly arm's length, in daylight, with both sides knowing a fight was coming. The mythology says this was the product of superior gunfighting skill by the Earp faction. The mathematics say something different. At those distances, with cap and ball percussion revolvers or early cartridge revolvers, hitting a human target with any degree of reliability required being close enough to smell the other person. The famous fast draw, the speed shooting exhibitions, the notion of 2 men standing 30 paces apart in a main street and exchanging accurate fire. That is almost entirely a creation of dime novels and later Hollywood. It did not describe the actual mechanics of frontier violence with any precision. What frontier violence actually looked like, when you read the primary source accounts, the newspaper reports, the legal testimony, the memoirs of the men who were there, was almost always one of 3 things. An ambush from cover at medium to long range, a brawl at contact distance where the gun was more useful as a club than as a firearm, or a military engagement where rifles and carbines were doing the killing and the handguns were carried as backup for when everything else had failed. The revolver was a sidearm. It was carried because it was convenient, because it fit on a belt, and because having 6 shots immediately available without reloading was genuinely useful in certain situations. But the men who understood violence on the frontier, the professional soldiers, the experienced lawmen, the hide hunters who had actually been in extended engagements, carried rifles. They carried rifles because rifles could hit things at distances where revolvers could not, because rifles delivered more energy on target, because rifles could be reloaded more reliably under stress, and because rifles used from cover turned a desperate situation into a manageable one. And the specific rifle they carried, from roughly 1873 onward, was the one that Oliver Winchester's company built in New Haven, Connecticut, the one that the sales catalog described simply as the Model 1873. The Winchester Model 1873 is the rifle that actually won the Wild West. Not in the mythological sense that one weapon wins anything, but in the operational sense that when you trace the actual record of who survived and who did not, in the most consequential engagements of the American frontier period, the Winchester 1873 appears with a frequency and a decisiveness that the Colt revolver simply cannot match. To understand why, you have to understand what the 1873 offered that nothing before it had. The story of frontier firearms before 1873 is largely a story of compromise. The cap and ball revolver, the percussion cap muzzle loader, the early metallic cartridge guns of the immediate post-Civil War period, all of them required some combination of slow reloading, careful handling of loose powder and ball, or tolerance for a mechanism that was genuinely unreliable in conditions of cold, rain, mud, and the kind of stress that frontier violence created. The Colt single-action Army revolver, introduced in 1873, was a genuine improvement. Chambered for the .45 Colt cartridge, it held 6 rounds and could be reloaded by opening the loading gate, ejecting spent cases one at a time and inserting fresh ones. Under optimal conditions, by a practiced hand, you could reload a Colt SAA in perhaps 30 to 45 seconds. In the chaos of an actual fight with your hands shaking and your attention divided, that time stretched considerably. The Winchester 1873 used a lever action mechanism, the refinement of a design that Winchester had been developing since the Henry rifle of 1860. The shooter worked a lever below the trigger guard, also which simultaneously ejected the spent case, cocked the hammer, and chambered a fresh round from the tubular magazine beneath the barrel. A practiced shooter could fire 15 rounds in under 30 seconds. Not accurate rounds at long range under stress, but 15 aimed shots at reasonable distances in the time it took a revolver shooter to fire 6 and begin the process of reloading. The magazine capacity alone changed the tactical calculus, but the 1873 also introduced something that sounds like a footnote, but was actually a revolution in the logistics of frontier life. The rifle was chambered in pistol calibers, specifically in .38-40 and .44-40 Winchester. The .44-40, the most popular variant, used the same cartridge as the Colt single-action Army revolver, chambered for that caliber. One box of ammunition served both weapons. For a man living and working on the frontier, whether as a rancher, a cowboy, a buffalo hunter, a prospector, or a lawman working territory that measured in hundreds of square miles, the logistical elegance of this arrangement was not trivial. Ammunition was expensive, heavy, and not always easy to obtain in remote areas. Carrying a single type of cartridge that fed both your rifle and your sidearm meant carrying less weight, spending less money, and maintaining fewer supply chains. It meant that in an emergency, the rounds from your rifle could feed your pistol and vice versa. This is the detail that separates people who have read about the frontier from people who have thought carefully about what living on the frontier actually required. Logistics were not a minor consideration, and they were often the primary consideration. The men who survived the longest in dangerous environments were frequently not the fastest or the most aggressive. They were the most careful and the most prepared. The Winchester 1873 and .44-40 was a logistical weapon as much as it was a tactical one. The Winchester Company understood this. Their marketing was direct about it. The sales materials did not emphasize speed or firepower in the abstract. They emphasized reliability, range, and the practical utility of a weapon that could serve both as a hunting rifle and a defensive arm without requiring the shooter to maintain separate ammunition supplies for each purpose. The adoption of the 1873 across the frontier was rapid and widespread. By the mid-1870s, the rifle was in the hands of buffalo hunters on the southern plains, ranchers in Texas and Arizona, stagecoach guards throughout the territory, and a significant percentage of the cavalry units and civilian scouts who were engaged in the ongoing and brutal series of campaigns against Comanche, Kiowa, Apache, Sioux, and Cheyenne resistance. It was also, critically, in the hands of the indigenous warriors those units were fighting. The United States Army in the 1870s and 1880s was, by the standards of its own time, poorly equipped for the kind of war it was fighting. The Army carried the Springfield trapdoor rifle and carbine, single-shot weapons chambered in .45-70 Government. The trapdoor was accurate at long range and delivered extraordinary energy on target. It was also single-shot, meaning that after each round the soldier had to manually open the breech, extract the spent case, insert a fresh cartridge, close the breech, and cock the hammer before firing again. The process took several seconds. In a mounted engagement or a situation where the opposing force was in significant number and was able to close the distance, those several seconds were a vulnerability. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Northern Arapaho, and other nations that faced the Army on the northern plains understood this vulnerability and exploited it. The Winchester 1873, acquired through trade, captured in raids on supply trains and Army detachments, or purchased directly from traders operating outside the legal restrictions that were supposed to prevent the sale of firearms to hostile groups, appeared in indigenous arsenals in significant numbers by the mid-1870s. The Battle of the Little Bighorn on June 25th and 26th, 1876, is the most famous military engagement of the Indian Wars and has been analyzed more thoroughly than almost any other military action of the 19th century. The forensic archaeology of the battlefield, conducted with metal detectors and careful site mapping beginning in the 1980s, provided data that was not available to earlier historians. That analysis revealed that the warriors who defeated Custer's 7th Cavalry were armed with a mix of weapons, but that repeating rifles, particularly Winchester models and their predecessors, were present in substantial numbers and played a decisive role in the engagement. The Army's trapdoor carbines were outgunned in the specific tactical conditions of that fight. In the open terrain of the Little Bighorn drainage, with warriors who were experienced in exactly the kind of mobile, body-fluid engagement that the Army's linear tactics were not designed to handle, the ability to fire 10 or 15 rounds without reloading was a tactical multiplier that the Army simply could not match. A warrior with a Winchester could generate a volume of fire that, in the noise and confusion of a cavalry charge, was effectively indistinguishable from a much larger number of opponents armed with single-shot weapons. This is not a romantic myth. This is what the physical evidence from the battlefield says. The cartridge casings recovered from the ridges and draws where the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors took their firing positions include a significant proportion of .44-40 and similar repeating rifle calibers. The distribution of Army cartridge cases tells a story of units that were unable to maintain coherent defensive positions, that were fragmented and overrun in detail, that could not generate the sustained defensive fire that their single-shot weapons required to be effective. The lesson was not lost on the Army. In the years following the Little Bighorn, the debate within the military establishment about the suitability of the trapdoor versus a repeating arm for cavalry use became significantly more urgent. The adoption of the Krag-Jorgensen bolt-action magazine rifle in 1892 represented, at least in part, the Army's institutional acknowledgement that the frontier experience had demonstrated the operational value of magazine capacity. But outside the military context, the Winchester 1873 was already reshaping the practical reality of frontier life in ways that the Colt revolver simply could not. The buffalo hunters who operated on the southern and northern plains in the 1870s represent one of the clearest examples of how the rifle, rather than the handgun, defined the frontier experience for the people who actually lived it. Buffalo hunting was not the romantic horseback activity of indigenous tradition. Commercial buffalo hunting in the 1870s was an industrial operation. Hunters worked in teams with 1 or 2 principal shooters supported by skinners, haulers, and camp workers. The shooters used specialized long-range rifles, most famously the Sharps in .45-70 or .50 caliber, capable of accurate fire at distances of several hundred yards. The Winchester 1873 was not the primary killing tool of the commercial buffalo hunt. That was the Sharps. But it was the defensive weapon of choice for the camp itself, for the approach to the herd, and for the moments when the Comanche or Kiowa resistance to the destruction of their food supply manifested as an attack on the hunters. The Second Battle of Adobe Walls in June 1874, where 28 buffalo hunters defended their camp against an estimated 250 to 700 Comanche and Kiowa warriors for 3 days, demonstrated both the importance of long-range rifle capability and the critical role of the lever-action repeater when the range closed. Billy Dixon's famous long shot at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls using a Sharps at what was later estimated at nearly a mile has entered frontier legend. What the legend tends to omit is that the hunters survived 3 days of sustained assault less because of individual marksmanship feats and more because of their ability to generate sustained, accurate defensive fire from prepared positions using the best available long-range weapons. Several of the hunters were armed with Winchesters alongside their Sharps, and the volume of fire those lever actions produced played a documented role in keeping the assault from succeeding. The range wars that consumed the cattleman's frontier in the 1880s and early 1890s provide another layer of evidence for the rifle's primacy in frontier violence. The Johnson County War in Wyoming in 1892, the Pleasant Valley War in Arizona in the late 1880s, the Lincoln County War in New Mexico that launched Billy the Kid into history in the late 1870s. These conflicts were not resolved by dueling pistoleros facing each other across dusty main streets. They were fought by men with rifles using cover, ambushing opponents on remote roads and at isolated ranch sites, conducting sustained sieges of fortified buildings, and employing the kind of tactical patience that revolver range engagement does not permit. Billy the Kid, whose legend is inseparable from the image of a fast gun and a drawn revolver, was in operational reality a rifle fighter. The Lincoln County War was fought primarily with Winchesters. The ambushes and raids that defined that conflict involved men shooting from distances where a revolver was essentially useless, and a rifle was the only tool that made tactical sense. The Kid's reputation for accuracy, and which was documented by contemporaries who knew him rather than by later dime novelists who invented him, was a reputation for rifle shooting as much as for pistol work. Pat Garrett, who killed Billy the Kid in a darkened bedroom at Fort Sumner in July 1881, did it with a single-action Colt revolver at virtually contact range, in a room where he had positioned himself before the kid entered. That is the most famous pistol shot in the legend of the frontier. It was fired from ambush in the dark at a man who did not know Garrett was present. It was not a fast draw duel. It was an execution conducted under conditions that required no particular shooting skill beyond the ability to pull a trigger when someone walked into the room. That is how frontier handgun violence actually worked. Not elegant, not theatrical, and not remotely like the mythology. The Colt revolver was useful for exactly one scenario where it could not be replaced by a rifle. The sudden, close-range emergency where there was no time to bring a long arm into action. In a saloon brawl, in a confrontation that escalated without warning to arm's reach. In the moment when a suspect being arrested produced a weapon faster than expected, the revolver's portability and immediate availability were its real advantages over any rifle. For everything else, the Winchester 1873 was the superior tool. The commercial success of the Winchester 1873 reflects this reality in the numbers that Oliver Winchester's company produced and sold. Between its introduction in 1873 and the end of production in 1919, more than 700,000 Model 1873 rifles and carbines were manufactured. 3 distinct configurations served different needs. The rifle with its 24-inch barrel was the choice of hunters and settlers who needed maximum range. The carbine, with its shorter 20-inch barrel, was preferred by cavalry troopers and cowboys who needed a weapon that could be worked from horseback or carried in a saddle scabbard without excessive bulk. The musket version, less common, served certain military and institutional buyers. At a time when the frontier population was counted in hundreds of thousands rather than millions, that is a saturation level that reveals how completely the rifle penetrated the lives of the people who inhabited the frontier economy. The Winchester Company's marketing slogan, "The gun that won the West," was introduced well after the frontier period had effectively ended and was understood, even at the time, as a commercial claim rather than a historical assessment. But the slogan contained a truth that the company had not quite managed to state with precision. The Model 1873 did not win the West in the sense of resolving a contest. What it did was define the practical capability available to the people who were making the frontier their operational environment, whether as settlers, hunters, soldiers, lawmen, or outlaws. The Colt single-action Army revolver is a more satisfying icon because it fits a more satisfying mythology. One shot, one kill, one man standing at the end of a street while another man falls. The drama of individual confrontation, the mythology of the fast draw, the idea that the frontier was a place where personal courage expressed through personal weapons settled the fundamental questions. That mythology required a handgun because a rifle does not fit the image of a man walking down a street. You cannot carry a rifle on a hip belt. You cannot draw it from a holster. The visual grammar of the Western requires the Colt, but the operational grammar of the frontier required the Winchester. The people who were trying to survive, to build something, to defend what they had built, to impose their will on a landscape and on the other people competing for that landscape, those people reached for the rifle when the stakes were real. The revolver was for the moments when the rifle was not available. The rifle was for the moments when you had chosen the terms of engagement yourself. There is a lesson in that distinction that extends beyond firearms history. The tool that becomes the symbol is rarely the tool that actually did the work. The Colt Peacemaker symbolizes the frontier because it photographs beautifully, because it fits a particular kind of masculine mythology, because it can be worn visibly at a man's side and becomes part of his silhouette. The Winchester 1873 is harder to photograph romantically. It does not fit on a hip. It does not lend itself to the theatrical gesture. But it was there at every consequential moment. At the Little Bighorn, in the hands of the warriors who broke the 7th Cavalry. At Adobe walls, in the hands of the hunters who held for 3 days. In the Lincoln County War, in the hands of both sides of every ambush and every siege. In the scabbards of the Army Scouts and the Buffalo Soldiers and the cavalry troopers who were trying to bring the official version of American civilization to a continent that already had several civilizations of its own. The gun that won the Wild West was a lever-action rifle made in New Haven, Connecticut, chambered in a caliber that also fed a Colt revolver, sold at a price that a working cowhand could afford, and carrying 14 rounds in a tubular magazine that made it, for its time and place, as close to a decisive tactical advantage as any single firearm ever came. It did not win any particular gunfight or any particular battle by itself. No weapon ever does. What it did was shift the odds consistently in favor of whoever held it, at the ranges and in the conditions where frontier violence actually occurred. That is what it means to win a war, not a single dramatic shot heard around the world. 1,000 small tactical advantages compounded over years in the hands of people who understood what they were holding. If this kind of primary source look at the history behind the mythology is what you came here for, subscribe and hit the bell. We go back to the actual record every time, the archaeology, the court testimony, the cartridge casings in the dirt, the real numbers behind the legend. Because the real history of the American frontier is more interesting than the mythology ever managed to be. Drop the gun you thought won the West in the comments. Let us have that argument. Because the answer, as always, depends entirely on what you mean when you say one.